I'm Alyssa Downey. I'm the Adult and Youth Services Librarian here at SFL. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to give a special thanks to Juliet Grames for all the work she's put into her program tonight. Also, thank you to the rest of the staff and the volunteers for their support in organizing this event. Just a reminder, the library summer reading program begins on Monday, June 19th, and children and adults can register using the Beanstack app on their phone or computer. More information about this can be found on the SFL website. Juliet was born in Hartford, Connecticut, and grew up in a tight-knit Italian-American family. Her son currently attends preschool in the borough. She has been a book editor for 20 years, and her debut novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, was shortlisted for the New England Book Award and the Connecticut Book Award, receiving Italy's Premio Centraro
Very close.
for, for contribution to Southern Italian literature. A main theme of the novel is Italian American immigration, and it is a story about grandmothers, mothers, and sisters. It's a story about resisting the patriarchy and the trauma of succumbing to it for generations. It's about immigration and the American dream. It's about the gap between our American identities and the cultural and spiritual roots that tug us in opposite directions. Juliet's going to talk all about that and more. Feel free to stop by the book table on your way out after the program to pick up a copy. Now, please put your hands together and help me in welcoming her.
You want to go do the honors? I trust you. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a Thursday night in the middle of summer. I'm really excited to be here because, as I was telling the amazing staff here, it's been a little bit. I haven't really been doing events during the pandemic, so libraries are my favorite place to be. Spoiler for this presentation: the end of it is going to be that really the American dream does boil down to literacy, and what we have here in the United States, this public library institution, is unlike any other country in the world. We're so lucky to be here. So thank you for patronizing your local library and for being here tonight. So as Alyssa was saying in the introduction, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna is a story about two sisters who emigrate from Italy in the 1930s, and they end up in Hartford, Connecticut. And it covers 100 years of their very long lives. When we meet them at the beginning of the book in their old age, you know that they've been locked in a blood feud for 30 years, but no one in their family understands why. And then the book goes back to the beginning, to their origins in World War I, and tries to pick apart what happened between them. The framework of the story is the main character, Stella, who is the older sister. She's beautiful. She's very charismatic. She's very fiercely intelligent, is also cursed. She has near-death experience after near-death experience in her life, and that's a little bit of a mystery. And her younger sister, Tina, who's the good girl, who, she works hard. She just wants to be a wife and mother. She's not so smart. She's not so beautiful, but, they're always caught in this competitive best friendship together over the course of their lives. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm not going to give you any spoilers besides that. I'm just going to tell you about the origin of where this story came from. So I am, in fact, Italian. Sometimes it's hard to tell by looking at me, but when you see the hand gestures, you'll know I was born in Hartford into an Italian American family, and my family is from that part of Italy, Calabria, the very toe of the boot. It is a place you probably haven't been because no one goes there. Although I'm going to try to talk you into going there because oh, you've been there? Yes. Okay. See, we'll convert all the people. It is very, very, very beautiful. It is called Calabria, from the ancient Greek Calabria, which means fertile land, and it was in fact colonized during the great era of Greek colonization, 700-800 BC, in time of the Iliad and the Odyssey and Herodotus and Homer, and it was the heart of Magna Graecia. So if you think of like Pythagoras, he was actually working in Calabria when you think of him as a Greek scientist, and Archimedes was in Sicily. But anyway, so it was the heart of this huge empire of culture, of learning for a really long time, and it's very beautiful. That's Stromboli, which is a volcano. They call it the Lighthouse of the Trenion. It's just smoking there next to this white sand beach. You should go visit, eat some delicious onions. They have these gorgeous hilltop cities that were all built sort of defensively because so many waves of conquerors were really interested in this very fertile land that the people who lived there, they went up the mountains and they built these preposterous, extremely altitudinous, gorgeous little cities on top of these very, very nice to visit. This here is my grandmother's village where she was born. It's called Yevoli, and I took this picture during a rainstorm. You can see, it's hard to see up here, but that's the marina is glowing in the sunset, and you can actually see Sicily beyond, and it's just so, so beautiful. And in 2015, when I knew I had finished my first draft of this novel, and I knew I wanted to make it more authentic, and interviewing people here in stateside wasn't enough. I had to go see Calabria for myself. So I did. I went and I lived in this village in the house that she grew up in, which is now owned by third cousins. I had never met them before, total strangers, but I showed up and I was gonna say they invited me to live with them, but it was really more they kidnapped me and forced me to live with them for a month. It was amazing. It was really good. But I just stood there on that church piazza and I looked down at this rainstorm in this gorgeous, gorgeous place. And I thought, how could they have ever left this behind? It's the great immigrant question. And I think so many of us share how our ancestors had to leave these places that they loved so much, that were so beautiful, and that they clearly carried in their hearts for the rest of their lives. Because I never, ever stopped hearing about how amazing Calabria was and how much my grandmother loved Diavoli. But um, it was very, very poor. So I stole this photo from Corbis, as you can see. But the one of my favorite questions to ask people when I'm doing a talk about this book is what year they think this photo was taken. And they say, oh, 1880, 1890. No, this was 1951. And people are still traveling on donkey back. You can see the stone walls are falling down. This was only a couple towns away from where my grandmother was born. It was really an abandoned part of Italy. Italy has had a lot of infrastructural challenges since unification and before. And the South has been really, really marginalized. The entire south of Italy, everything really below Rome, and harvested for what it had to offer, which used to be natural resources and now is really humans. And people are forced to leave to labor elsewhere, basically, in order to support their families. And that was my grandparents, my great grandparents were part of that continuum. And it's going on to this day. There's still an exodus, a lot of ghost villages in the South because people can't afford to live and work there. And you hear bad things. You hear about, oh, my mother, when she first visited this hometown in 1972, there was no running water. People were washing their underwear in the stream. There was no electricity. The roads weren't paved. You hear about corruption. You hear about crime. You hear about all of these very dire things for why Calabria is so far behind the rest of the country. And people often point fingers at the people who live in this area as being beyond redemption. And when I was first trying to reconcile this myself, to learn about my own origins and about my family, something was really rubbing me the wrong way about that. Everything I read in English, and then later when I learned Italian so that I could read more, they were telling this story about poverty and about misery. And I knew that my people had to leave because things were very hard. But I knew that wasn't the whole story, because I knew a lot of these people. I knew that they were funny, that they were wise, that they were tough as heck, and that they still loved this place that they had been driven from. And when we got here, they gave us these incredible lives, these very rich, rewarding lives full of the opportunities they hadn't had. They were brave and they were dauntless. And I thought, there's something here that's missing. It's the story, it's the human story that's being overlooked. And I wanted to try to write that. I really wanted to write about Calabria in a way that humanized it, and that reminded us that it is more than the sort of poverty platform that it's become today. So yeah, this is a photo of this was also taken in the same year in 1952, in a village very close to where my grandmother was born. These are ladies picking olives, And they, the women in these families, they held the families together while the men emigrated and tried to make cash. Women were not citizens until 1946, so they couldn't own property, they couldn't control money, they had no rights of their own, but they fought to keep families together. They went and worked in the olive groves, they picked olives, and they were paid in olive oil that got pressed from the olives they picked, and that was their lives, and they made it work, and they raised huge families. And I thought, I'm going to tell a story about them. We're going to talk about the female side of immigration. We're going to talk about our grandmothers and their stories that might have been overlooked. And that was really the birth of Stella Fortuna. I wanted to tell the Calabrian woman's story. And if you have a Calabrian grandmother, then this book is dedicated to her. And that is my Calabrian grandmother, and that's me. She was a very big part of my life. She passed away just 6 months before my book came out. So it's dedicated to her, and she didn't get to see it. But the other person who was a really big part of my life was her sister. So that's my grandmother, and that is my Aunt Con there. And this photo was taken the year that they emigrated to the United States. They very boldly cut off their hair. It was Christmas of 1940, and they were going to be really American. It was, the war was the conflict between America and Italy was starting to boil up, and they were here. They were going to live this life, and they were just amazing. They were best friends. They were a year apart in age. They were both born in Italy. They immigrated when they were 19 and 17 and a half, respectively. They married best friends. They bought houses next door to each other that overlooked the same plot of land, very marshy, kind of good for tomato plants, but very muddy for the kids to play in. That proximity was very lucky for both of them, because my aunt, who had dreamed her entire life of being a wife and mother, it was all she ever wanted, was very unlucky with fertility and was unable to have children. And my grandmother, who never wanted to have kids, was blessed with many, many, many children. And because they had that shared yard, my aunt was able to have that sort of proxy mother experience, and my grandmother had someone to take care of her kids for her because she really, really did not want to do it herself. So as a result, my aunt I was very close to her. She was really like my grandmother, for reasons we will discuss shortly. But this is them in 1988. My publishers at HarperCollins nicknamed this photo the Bathing Beauties, and I love that. It makes me really happy to see it. This is down at Rocky Neck, where they would go every summer. They'd bring a big Tupperware full of pasta, which they would eat on the beach. I assume everyone eats pasta on the beach, right? It's good for the kids' digestion to have a little sand in there. Anyway, but this story ends sadly. This was the last happy photo I have of them ever, because 4 months later, in December, my grandmother had an accident. She fell down her cellar stairs and she sustained a cerebral hemorrhage. Um, and her life was saved, just barely saved, by a lobotomy, which at the time was experimental. And the doctors thought she probably wasn't going to survive. They said if she did survive, she would be in a wheelchair, she would be eat with a feeding tube, she would never walk or talk again. This was not the case. She had an absolute miracle recovery. As I mentioned, she went on to live another more than 30 years after that. And in fact, I found a photo of her dancing at a party in a silver dress and lipstick, and you can still see her head is still shaved from the lobotomy. So she had like really, really miracle recovery, and we were all very lucky to enjoy her for another 30 years after that. But she had been lobotomized, so all was not well upstairs, and her personality was altered, and a couple key points were not what they had been before. So, for example, she always got her languages scrambled. She couldn't code switch correctly. So, one time she came to my fourth grade class to talk about immigration, she would only speak Italian instead of English, that kind of thing. And the biggest change by far was that when she woke up from her coma, she hated her sister. She would never speak to her again. That was it. She couldn't explain why. This woman who had raised her children, they'd married best friends, they'd lived together for the first 68 years of their lives. She would never speak to her again for the rest of her life. And this was really, really hard on my aunt, because my grandmother, whatever had happened in her head, it was conclusive. But for my aunt, this her best friend had been taken away by a medical emergency, and furthermore, she lost some access to her children because this is children in quotation marks here. If you have to spend Christmas dinner either with your sick mother or with her sister, and you have to pick one or the other because one of them will, you know, violently attack the other if they're in the same room. You're of course going to pick your sick mother, right? So we had this very sad scenario where my aunt, who did all the cooking and cleaning for both of their households, would secretly cook in the morning. She'd sneak through the backyard. She'd leave the food for Christmas dinner, like the ravioli, at my grandmother's house and sneak back home. We would eat at my grandparents' house, and then afterward we'd have to drive our cars away and park them elsewhere and then sneak to my aunt's house to have dinner at her house because my grandmother would get so angry if she found out we were like cheating on her by going to see her evil sister. It was very, very heartbreaking. And I know what's on your mind right now, which is, what are those green things, right? That's what those are. Zucchini. That's, yeah. This woman, she was formidable. I mean, everything she did was bigger and more than anyone else I've ever met. I don't know, but so my aunt Con was really the other origin point of this story, because when I was growing up, I don't know, I remember I was sick. I was 5 when my grandmother had the accident. By the time I was 6, not particularly emotionally intelligent 6-year-old, I will tell you, but I realized how messed up this scenario was. So I invited my aunt to grandparents' day instead of my grandmother that year because I thought, you know what, I'm going to be her grandkid. I'm going to formalize this. We're going to make it happen. And we did. That was like our relationship until she passed away, which was like, sorry, it's like only 4 months after her sister died. It was like they couldn't even be apart and parted by death. But she was just amazing. So I sort of started realizing, by shadowing her, by trying to write down her story and retain her recipes and her lessons, that she had so much to say. She had stories to tell, and a big story she had to tell was about my grandmother. There was a lot of, I don't want to say guilt, but she had a lot of feelings she could never put to rest about whatever had happened between them, that had caused my grandmother to cut her off after the coma. And my aunt would always tell me, I just want her to know that I love her. I just want her to know that I love her. And she sat with me for hours, I don't know, hundreds of hours of interviews. And I decided I wanted to write this book. I was probably working on it for 10 years over time, in the mornings before my full-time job, trying to also wrap my head around the content I wanted to use to be appropriately researched, to be able to be authentic about telling this story. And during that time, she sat for formal interviews, which she let me tape. She introduced me to other people in her community here, Italian immigrants, Calabrian immigrants specifically, their children. And then when I finally did make that research trip to Italy, when I was ready to do that, she even introduced me to people in Yevoli who she hadn't seen in 80 years but had kept in touch with. It was incredible. So she's really the backbone of this book, is what she gave me, and I hope that it's a memory to her. So after this, I'm going to show you a few research things I collected. I'm almost done with my presentation, so I'll take questions after that. But a lot of pieces went into this book to make it, I hope, a 5 sensory experience for you, to try to capture this world that is missing. 100 years ago, a very different place, a place that was illiterate. One of the things they didn't have was schools. In 1920, when my grandmother was born, the official statistic is that 85% of Calabrians were illiterate. And in my grandmother's town, they didn't have a school at all, so there was no option to learn to read. So I had to rely on other texts besides written histories, especially because all the written histories are so derogatory. Like I was saying, they're really one-sided. And so luckily there were photo archives, like the one I pulled, this amazing photo time, Nicastro. It's now like one village that's part of 3 other villages, but this was 1926. So I mean, just so much cool stuff that you can pull out of a photo like this. If you can see, first of all, the older woman with the bundle on her head. And the first time I went to Calabria in 2014, I would still see old women carrying bundles on their heads, perfectly balanced. But you spend half your day carrying water up a mountain to wash your clothes and stuff. You carried a lot of things on your head. They're barefoot, you can see, and the amazing costume that they're all wearing. If you can see, they have the same structure of dress. It crosses over here over their neck, and there's actually three skirts. This is called a pakiana. It's really specific to this area. No one else wears them, but it's a costume that every woman will sort of invest in when she's 13 or 14. And that's she'll wear for the rest of her life. It has three different, you'll have a black skirt over a colored skirt over a white skirt. And the color of the skirt that you choose denotes your station in life. So an unmarried woman will wear green, a married woman will wear red, and a widow will wear black. And it's just like some of them are so elaborate, like the Fiste Pacchiana with lace and gold embroidery. And I don't know if you've ever seen those collectible painted postcards that will have like, you know, a lady with a lace handkerchief and like a little thing. Yeah, I mean, those are just, they're so elaborate and fancy, these festival costumes. But so I did, you know, spend a lot of time dredging through photo archives to try to texture this book that I'm writing to bring it home, this very different time and space. I also visited a lot of folk museums, and that was really informative. This is my other favorite audience participation slide. Can anyone guess what kind of tools we are looking at? Lace making. That is the closest anyone has ever come on a guess. Everyone always either says pasta making or they say musical instruments. These are what? Another really good guess. It is textile. You're so close. These are silkworm farming devices. So they are different spindles, and this one here, which is called a cunocchia, there's no name for it in Italian, only in Calabrese dialect. But these are for silkworm farming, and and did you know that southern Italy had a huge silk industry? No, it's been totally lost. So in World War II, it just became too expensive, and there were silk factories in Milan that were doing it much more efficiently than the cottage industries were doing. So it completely died away. But actually, yeah, because Calabria was under the Emirate of Sicily. From depending on different parts of Calabria were subdued at different times, but from the early 800s all the way through the 13th century, so you know about 500 years, and the Arabs brought silkworm farming from China, and it was the major industry. It was also the way women could have any kind of dowry when they weren't allowed to control money. They could control this fine good of raw silk, and what they would do is they would actually take the silk eggs and they would tie them under their dresses and they would hatch them in the warmth of their body and then tend them for 24 hours a day for the month. It would take a 28-day cycle for them to come to maturity. And there was a vendor, usually the peddler would often also be female, who would vend them the eggs that she would grow in reed baskets in the marsh. It's incredible. It's so interesting. And the way I discovered this was actually because of my grandmother's um her lobotomy. This was a lost story that we hadn't known about. And she came to my fourth grade class to talk about immigration in Italian. And and so luckily my mother came to translate. And so my grandmother gets up there in front of this group of kids and she starts talking about worms. And then my mother stops her and reroutes her and it's like, no, Ma, we want to talk about, you know, leaving Napoli and the seeing the Statue of Liberty for the first time. And my grandma's like, oh, okay. And so she, you know, reroutes. And then after the class was over, my mother says to her, Ma, why were you talking about worms to those poor kids? And my grandmother goes, well, you asked me about life in the old country, so I was telling them what we did. And my mother and I are both, you know, my mother who's now retired teacher, but she had no idea that that silk came from Italy at all, and B, that her mother had been involved in it, because it didn't matter. Once they came here, this is buried history. And then, you know, she asked my great aunt, who totally, you know, was completely cognitively with it and could have told us the story at any time. And she's like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. This huge part of our lives. We left it behind. We never did it again. So it just didn't occur to us to tell our children. And I think that was the thing that my grandmother's lobotomy gave us, was a fresh reminder of some of the things that were still immediate for her that had been lost to time and place. And she was so valuable. I gave you a kind of innocent example of one of those things that she told me. Some of them were much less innocent, but we won't get into that now. Yeah. So I also went through a lot of documents. If anyone here is Italian, yeah, I yes. well, we're probably related, to be honest, but but I encourage you, if you're Italian, one thing everyone complains about how disorganized Italians are, etc., and this all may be true, but they keep really, really very rich municipal archives. I think because so much of the population has been forced away by immigration, there is always the hope on the other end that we're eventually going to come home. All of these lost children and grandchildren, and they have retained a copy of every visa, I mean, it's just all there. So I found, this is my great grandmother, and I found her in a municipal archive, and I was just, lots and lots of records. You can also get records like this. So if you speak any Italian, atti di nascita up top, that means the birth certificate. So this is my great grandfather's birth certificate. Can you see the X through it? Yeah, this is his canceled birth certificate. Yeah, this says in this tiny scrawling writing, let me see if I can even find it. I can't find it right now. Sorry, I won't waste your time. But it says figlio naturale, which means, if you speak Italian, natural son, which if you speak Victorian English means bastard. So this was his birth certificate that was canceled when he was formally adopted at age 9 by his biological father. So I went to the municipal archives and I found this. And I thought, gee, how many of his children knew this story about his past? He had not seen fit to carry that particular story to the new world with him. It was something he left behind. And I love the tension of those secrets, of deciding who we're going to be when we leave one country for another. And I'm going to leave you with that because I don't want to spoil the book anymore. But yeah, so again, thank you for coming today. If you want to ask me any questions about this, if you have read the book, please don't spoil it for people who haven't. That's my one request. But otherwise, yeah. Thank you all. And if you don't have any questions, I do have this. I'm going to start a newsletter. I haven't done it yet, but if you want to be on it aspirationally, put your email down here, and I would love to. I have a book coming out next. You can just hand it around. If people don't want to sign it, they don't have to. I have a book coming out next July, and then now this is my home area, so we'll be doing our launch here for once. Yeah, it's also, yeah. I don't teach. Okay. Yeah. No. Oh no, sorry. When I was in fourth grade. Oh. Yeah. No, I talk fast. That's why I don't teach, because I talk very fast. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what are you gonna do? Yeah. No, I'm a book editor by day. Yeah. 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 Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. 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 Someone suggested that. I'm not ready for nonfiction yet. I love writing fiction, but someday when I do sit down, I will definitely have a very long chapter or maybe an entire book about the research trip to Italy I took with my mother. Yeah, that was. There's at least 300 pages there. So. She was born in Hartford. Yeah. Yep. Yep. That's right. Yep. Oh yeah. Yeah, they lived on Bedford Street. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Oh, well, it was very long. I'll try to give you the short story. So I work in publishing. I've worked in publishing for 20 years. So I'm an editor specifically. So I see a lot of books that are not ready to be published. I see a lot of those. I reject a lot of those. And I was deathly afraid of showing my book to anyone and having them think that about it, because I thought, oh, your whole professional reputation will be at stake. You'll never show your face in this town again. So I wandered in private over this text for a very, very long time. A very long time. I have the whole thing memorized. I think I've read it out loud to myself probably 16 times just to make sure that I knew where every word was. But yeah, I'll give you a slightly more honest story, I guess, because you guys are my hometown. You're not going to judge me, but I decided in 2015 that I was ready to try to let the world see it, and so I started looking for a literary agent. I don't know if anyone here has done that. It is a very demoralizing process. I knew all of the literary agents, and I was friends with a lot of them, so I thought this will go easier for me than it goes for other people. And I spent 2 years trying to find an agent, and I couldn't get anyone to answer my calls. Or they told one person told me, people told me again and again, they were like, oh, this should be a love story, or this needs to be half of the length that it is now, or like the best feedback I got was, I really loved this, but publishers aren't looking for this kind of book. It's too ambitious. And I was like, I don't. So after about 18 months, I went home to do some soul searching, and I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm such a hypocrite. I can't listen to the advice of professionals, but I'm dishing it out all day. So I went home. I was like, I'm going to cut this book in half. I'm going to make it, into a thing that people want to read, a more commercial property. And I tried to do it, and I got to the end, and I was like, you know what? I'd rather not publish it. I wrote it for pure reasons to tell this story. I wanted to vindicate my grandmother. I wanted to vindicate all of the misunderstood grandmothers of all of us, all these women who were silenced by these generations of protecting the patriarchy or protecting the reputations of our grandfathers. I wrote it, and that was it. I was done. I wasn't going to change anything. And if it was never published, then it wasn't meant to be. That was fine. I was going to move on. And then the next day I got an email from a friend of a friend who was a literary agent. And she said, I heard you've written a book. Can I read it? And I was like, sure. I didn't, she was someone I didn't know. She read it. She offered to represent it like 2 days later. And then she went to submit it to editors. And we had a 10-party auction, which is like unheard of. So I was like, all 2 years worth of agents told me that editors weren't interested in this book. And the editors were all sitting there. They're like, we're waiting for something we haven't seen before, instead of the thing the agents give us over and over, which is the same thing. This is a true story. And I think the moral of the story is, one, there are two morals to the story. One is finding an agent is hard, don't give up. And moral number two is keep writing, because nothing else matters except your craft. The only thing you can control in this whole process is your craft, right? Everything else involves these third parties who are sometimes just wrong, and you can't let them get you down. You have to trust your gut instinct, and you have to keep working. You have to just go back to the desk and you can make yourself better every day. And if you keep doing that, then eventually you will either have success, or you will be the best writer you could be. And that's not, that's a success in and of itself. So yeah, that's my story. And then after that, it was wonderful. I had a dream scenario. Publishing was, yeah, it was very good. Yeah. You had a question, didn't you? Did I answer it? Sorry. Yeah. 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 I would say, like research all told, about 7 years. Yeah, sitting my butt in a chair and actually writing the draft did not take very long. But I'm working on my third book, so I know what my process is, and it's 3 to 5 years of research and deep reading. And I'm a failed historian, basically, so I love that part of it. But writing will happen pretty fast for me when all the pieces are in place. So yeah, but you really have to do the front end stuff. And I've, both times, written almost the entire draft and then thrown it away because I didn't feel like I had the authentic voice. And so both of my published novel and my contracted novel that's coming out next year, I did that with both of them. I'm assuming I'm probably gonna have to do it for the third one too. I'm already dreading it, but what are you gonna do? Yes. I would love to. Wow, what a fantastic question from a perhaps a bookseller in the back. so so I definitely, when I this book is long. It's 424 pages if you're holding it. When I first drafted it, it was much longer. And I decided to make people agree to read it. I was going to have to cut out a lot of the pieces. And so it's really, Stella Fortuna is focused on the lives of immigrant women. But one of the things that really fell on the cutting room floor was the story of the immigrant men I was interviewing. And there are some wild stories. I mean, heartbreaking, or really just mind-boggling adventures that some people went through, that what I call the lost generation, which is the like 1900s to 1920. A lot of these men who did come over without any resources and who maybe were never heard from again by their families. Um, Things that happened, work accidents, falling prey to organized criminal syndicates, running away with another woman. I mean, all of these things are possibilities, but these families were ruptured and broken by the exploitation of immigrant labor, right? And as I was in the middle of all of this research and these interviews, I actually found out. So my son, the one who goes to Calvary, we named him after our grandfathers, and I love my Italian grandfather, and uh, I just like totally revere him. And my son has his name, and I found out that he had been named after an uncle who had died in America. He had gone to work in the coal mines in Virginia, West Virginia, excuse me, and he had died in a mine accident. And that was sad. But what happened then was, as I was digging more, I was lucky enough to run into an amateur genealogist who traced he found the misspelling of my great great uncle's name, and he pulled out the actual records from that area. My great great uncle was not killed in a mine accident. He was murdered. And he was 19 years old, and he was murdered by his best friend. And if you read the facts of it, it's pretty obvious that it was 1908, and that was definitely a frame job related to the Black Hand, which was the earliest American version of the mafia. They preyed upon, specifically upon, Italian immigrants who had no resources or language skills that let them kind of take advantage of American municipal protections and defenses and police forces. So um, now my son has the name of this murder victim who everyone thought had died in a coal mining accident. I mean, it was right there in my own family, right? And the thing is that these stories, they're wild, but they're everywhere. And I was like, also, I will say that my day job is I edit mysteries, and I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to try my hand at writing a mystery. So it's a mystery novel set in Calabria in 1960, and it is about a young woman who is working on a charity project there, and who unwittingly gets dragged into the role of sort of the town immigrant detective to figure out where a number of missing men from that town have ended up. So the themes are, yeah, immigration, organized crime, reconstruction after the war. Yeah. It's called The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia, and it's coming out next July. So mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I tell them everything. My family's been a huge part of this whole process. Yeah. No, it still gives me goosebumps to talk about. And this is now, years ago that I found out. It's a creepy one. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Well, listen, this is what I want to say about Ferrante. I don't care who she is. And if that was a man who wrote those books, you know what? God bless him, because he is so, if or she, whoever wrote it, that experience is so real. Those details are so real. When I was reading about her experience as a 13-year-old girl who stressed about her math grades, I was a 13-year-old girl stressed about my math grade. I lost sleep that night. I mean, it was so, so perfect. So, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I had that thought. That was my initial reaction when I heard that theory, and then I realized that I actually don't care. I don't care. Yeah. Well, that's very generous of you. I endeavor to earn that. Yes. No, my pleasure. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Mhm. Well, this is the reason that I wrote a novel instead of nonfiction. Um, I I found the ending of their story very difficult. I found the fact that there were 30 years without rapprochement, without redemption. It was a real heartbreaker for me. And I wrote this book in part to explore the fictional potentials of what might have happened between them because I couldn't understand it myself, but also I don't know, to offer some path toward, I did not follow their life path identically with the route I took in the fiction. So yeah, I mean the real life story is a sad one for sure. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I called the book this jokingly from the first time it was like an idea in my mind because I knew my grandmother had actually had, at the point I started writing the book, she had had 8 near death experiences, although one of them was debated about like whether it had happened or not. So, I think I just put, and I knew I wanted Stella Fortuna was the name I had given her fictitiously in my head. So I just opened a manuscript, a Word doc on my computer, and I called it this, and I saved it. I figured someday someone would make me change it, and no one made me change it. It came very close. Um, it came very close. My British editorial team. So the year my book came out, which was 2019, other books that came out were The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and also a book called The Seven and a Half Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which originally, when it was sold, was titled The Seven or Eight Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. And so, but they ended up changing it. And neither of those is in my genre. So, and I was like, I've worked in publishing a long time. I know how these things work. I wasn't really bothered by it. But they were like, no, we can't do that. It's too similar. We'll need to change the title. And I was like, okay, what do you want? And they were like, how about just Stella Fortuna? I was like, sure, that's fine. No, it'll just be called Stella Fortuna, easy to remember. And my agent tried to sell me on it. She's like, think of like Charlotte, think of Emma, or think of, Jane Eyre. You'll be on the shelf with them. And I was like, thanks, Sarah. That's nice. And and then in the end, the editor took it to sales conference, and someone, actually one of the Italian sales reps, stood up and she was like, the original title of this manuscript was The Seven or Eight Deaths of Stella Fortuna. Why are you changing that amazing title? And they were like, okay, we'll go back. So it didn't happen. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Well, I'm glad to hear it. I don't know. It was one of those things that was meant to be. I think titling is really hard. So I'm glad I didn't have to do it. I've had to title a lot of other people's books, or like brainstorm, or you just like pace in a room for about 4 hours. Sometimes you get beer and you make other people join you, and everyone's pacing and they're throwing ideas at the wall, and they're trying to, and you'll come up with a list of 35 things, and some of them are ridiculous, and the author is like, oh man, I wish we could go back to my original. It's a very painful process. I'm glad we didn't have to do that. It would have been awful. Uh, yes. Yeah. The biggest mistake, I would say that there are two. There are two. One is a book that is potentially really good. It has the energy, it has the story, and the person wrote the draft and thought that writing the draft was the same thing as writing the book, which is not the case, right? I think like probably 80% of the time an author should spend on a book is in editorial process. So I think that is the most common thing. The other thing I see really commonly is someone who really loves to write and therefore has gone through an exercise with themselves where they have written a book length piece of prose, and they think that because they wrote it, therefore it needs to get published. But it's not the book that that person needs to write. And that mismatch happens a lot. And I think especially you see with debut novels, and sometimes you see the spark of what they should be writing in it, but either they're listening to advice about genre shapes or things like that, and they haven't there's just a mismatch between the story that they think they should be telling and the one that would really sing for a reader, right? Um, and I mean, I think the interesting thing about book publishing is you've got two ends of this. You've got like an art situation where an artist is completely should have the freedom to create the art that they want, right? That's what writing is. It is an art. However, the consumer product of the book itself should satisfy the needs of a reader. And so the book that the writer should be allowed to write, which of course they're allowed to write, isn't necessarily a book that readers need. And creating that bridge there where you find the book that is both like the heart project of the artist and is also a thing that really reaches readers is like that's the dream, right? To build that bridge. So that's what you're going in to a submission and you're like, is there a bridge? Can I build a bridge here? And if you can't see how to build the bridge, you pass on stuff that's good. But yeah, I think. Mhm, mhm, mhm. So this morning, a man named Robert Gottlieb passed away. He was the editor he was the publisher of Knopf. He was also publisher, I think, of Simon and Schuster. He was 92. He was like one of these great publishing people. And so there's a lot of sort of memorials about his life right now. But one thing I recommend that my assistant editor Nick pulled out for me this morning, he said you should read this, and he was right. The Paris Review has taken from behind their paywall a series of interviews that were done with Robert Gottlieb in 1994, I think, and with a lot of his authors weighing in, like Joseph Heller and Toni Morrison and Bob Caro, and it's really neat. But he talks about that. Um, he talks about like what is book publishing? Is it to make money? Is this a business or is it an art industry? And it has gone through some fluctuations in the 20th and 21st century. It started out as a bunch of rich people who wanted an art project to, they would take risks with their own capital to put out things that they loved. And then it became sort of capitalized, capitalistic, and became about moving product and selling things. And now we're in a space where we're in between. I think there's a lot of vibrancy happening in independent publishers who are less bound by the constrictions of a board or investors. Um, but it's the spectrum. There are books that are published that are totally product. There are books that are not published that are beautiful and should have a readership if they were found. There are gatekeepers along the way, like agents who only get a 15% commission, so they're looking for the money projects, and they have to. I'm not blaming them, but they're not looking for the book that they're going to sell for $500 to an indie press, and so those books get overlooked. And then you get situations where I think true art is also reaching a very large group of people, where you have something, really beautiful that also gets mass popularity. All of those things happen. And it's not perfect. It's very much a broken system. Um, but yeah, for sure, for sure. And I think the best thing that you can do as a reader is keep your mind open about where you're getting your books from, and support the institutions like your local library, where people are taking chances to look at tastemaking and to look at what's out there, and we read to build empathy. So yeah, looking for those empathetic reading experiences is you can't go to the grocery store and look at the spinner rack there. That won't help you. So yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. Yeah, it does. And before that, yeah, yeah, um, yeah. Socrates talks about that actually in, or Plato, I should say. Plato talks about Socrates talking about that, so it goes back. Um, no, thank you. This has been so much fun. I hope you'll keep in touch, and maybe we'll see each other again